Welcome to the Brothers in Media with the bros who know, Scott and Craig Colby. Science, once a pillar of society, it is now a source of controversy. Some people trust it, others actively distrust it. Why is that? And what can be done to improve science communication? We're going to start this conversation with, as always, my brother Scott Colby. Scott is a journalist with 36 years of experience as a reporter, columnist, editor, photographer, and designer, as well as a national best-selling author and the creator of the Coach Colby Writing Academy. That's a lot of stuff. Visit his website, coachcolby.me, for a free insider's cheat sheet on how to write effective op-eds. But Scott is not a scientist.
I'm not a scientist. And this is Craig Colby, and he spent 37 years in broadcasting. He's an award-winning executive producer and the author and owner of Colby Vision, a video production company and consulting company. But Craig is not a scientist, but our dad, Peter J. Colby Kingwalla, is. But he's not on the show. Who's on the show, Craig?
Fortunately, our guest today is one of the best science communicators Canada has ever produced. He is a member of the Order of Canada, the former host of Discovery Channel's Daily Planet, and before that at Discovery Canada when I worked on it. CBC Radio's Quirks and Quarks, a best-selling and award-winning author. It's like Scott and I put together plus some. And he was the chair in science communication at the Banff Center. I worked with him back in our Discovery Channel days. Welcome, Jay.
Welcome, Jay.
Hey, guys. You know what intrigues me about you two, besides the fact that you're brothers? One of you has spent 36 years in the business, and the other spent 37. That's an uncannily close.
Well, we're 2 years apart in age, so.
And I took a second degree.
So one of you was lazy for a year.
Well, I took
Craig decided to get multiple degrees.
Oh, yeah.
I decided to get a job.
That's sometimes a good decision.
That helped me a lot. It's helped me a lot, that extra degree. Anyway, happy to have it. So let's just
glad to be here.
Yes, and you, as you said it, as we were setting up, you are not a scientist, but you have a scientist degree. You're a scientist enough for us today, and really one of the best this country's ever had in explaining science to people. First question I want to ask you about is, science it seemed like a beating during the pandemic. The science was coming in, scientists were working really hard to make things happen. And yet people distrusted the results from scientists. Why do you think there was so much distrust towards science then?
That's a very hard question, and I can only, suggest some of the influences I think were going on. But it is a bit of a mystery. But let's go slightly pre-pandemic and acknowledge that always in society, there's a certain amount of distrust of quote unquote experts. And this came to the fore strongly in the pandemic because experts were telling us lots of bad things. And this especially showed up in what used to be my home province, Alberta. They were restricting or wanting to restrict people's lives. There's always a group of people who don't want, in Alberta in the 50s, there were people who protested safety belts in cars, seat belts. Like, why would you do that? It's because it cuts into your independence. And that's always there. When you add to that further restrictions on your life, plus being told something you don't want to hear. People do not want to be told the way they're living their lives is wrong. And, that accounts for the pushback against taking measures to reduce climate change or to stabilize climate change, right? People don't want to be told they're using too much fossil fuels. So I think it grew out of an already existing state of mind that exists, in what I'm pretty sure is a minority of people, but it's a minority of people who have access to social media. So you put all of, sort of weave all of those threads together, and it provides the kind of weird situation we see today where, back in the day when I was doing Quirks and Quarks, we were often accused of cheerleading for science. Now, if you're doing similar work, you're having to defend science. So it's a major turn.
Yes, there's a blues song by Johnny Bassett from Detroit, and I love the title. It's "Save Your Breath, Baby." Save your breath, baby. I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do. And that seems to be
Yeah, that sums it up.
that sums it up. So once we get this divide, look, I'm going to be honest. I'm a cheerleader for science, and that started, with my dad, but it also really was reinforced working with you and learning more about scientists and how they work and what science has done for us. I had the advantage of rolling around in that for a decade. So we have an advantage in this that other people don't. How do we talk to people on the other side of that divide?
Well, it's tricky. I think the very first thing is there's an asymmetry going on here because scientists would like to correct this misconception of what they're doing. But people who are opposed to science aren't really interested in that, having that conversation. And a conversation is really what you have to do. So, there are some prominent people all over the world, but I'm more familiar with those in Canada who sort of grew out of the skeptic movement, where, somebody comes up with a crazy idea like Bigfoot exists, and skeptics pounce all over them and point out how stupid they are and how wrong they are. So there's always been this kind of thread. The skeptical, sorry, it's hard to say. Skeptical scientists have now expanded to beat back conspiracy theories, people who are have unease with vaccines and so on. But their approach, generally, I would say, is wrong because it's as much a push as it is an attempt to accommodate and have a conversation. And so what you end up with is people pushing against vaccines, people pushing for vaccines, and you can kind of understand that not much is going to happen in that setting. One of the other problems is that, and scientists admit this, but I don't think they admit it with conviction. The scientific word today on whatever subject is incomplete. That's the way science works. Everybody, a scientist knows that. The fact that you publish a paper saying X doesn't mean that X is going to be true even a year from now, let alone 5 years from now. And so people who are not wanting to be told what they should believe and what they should do just dismiss stuff as, well, that's just a theory. Like evolution. It is technically the theory of evolution, but people tend to use that word as meaning, well, nobody really knows whether it's true or not. That's not true of the theory of evolution. It is true. And so you've got these things about, people want tidy stories, right? They want to know that if you do this, here's the benefit to you. Or if you do that, here's the detriment. But it's never that clear cut. And you have to go with the way the research is pointing you at any moment, even though you have to admit that as time passes, that might not have been the right choice. So there's nuance. How do you deal with nuance when people are implacably opposed? That's the issue.
Yeah, can I just ask you a little bit about we'll get to the media, role of the media, but I want to talk a little about the role of scientists in this, because, I used to, when I was young and I first started in the business, I was working for the Thunder Bay newspaper, and I happened to be living at home at the time because that's our hometown. And our dad, Peter Colby, was a senior scientist with the Ontario government, walleye research. So we'd have these really interesting conversations around the dinner table about what research he was finding and this and that and the other thing. And I said, Dad, you have to talk about this, right? And he goes, no, I don't want to talk to the media. That's not my job. Or maybe he's, his boss has to talk to the media. So I think communication by scientists is part of the problem, and I'm not blaming scientists because I know a lot of them are muzzled. But just as you say, like things are nuanced, and they don't want to come out and necessarily have a definitive statement when there isn't a definitive statement to be made. So, I mean, what role do you see scientists playing in their, I guess, inability, either through restrictions being placed on them by their bosses or their training? Because I see this a lot with academics. In my job as an opinions editor, a lot of academics struggle to say what they want to say in the media in a short amount of time. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I wish much more time and attention was spent in universities and various research institutes to be able to communicate properly with the public. And I'm still quite active in working on workshops for scientists. And it's kind of frustrating because, you know, I and some of my closest colleagues have been saying the same things to groups of scientists for 20 years. And the needle hasn't moved all that much. And here's, I think, the fundamental problem is, and you guys would know this, if you're a scientist and you're researching and you found something that seems somewhat important, you want to get it published in a scientific journal. And there's a framework for an article in a scientific journal. Starts with the abstract, where you give a very short summary, then a whole bunch of background, then a whole bunch on how you did it, and then the results, and then the conclusions. The conclusions are what we all want to know. If a journalist is telling the same story, it's completely the reverse. They, and Craig, you remember this when we were doing Daily Planet. Quite often, the first question in an interview is, "What have you found?" Well, that's the conclusion. We never would say, "How did you do this experiment?" Or give me the last 30 years history of this field in which you're working. And so the story arc. Well, first of all, in a journal, you can't even call it a story; it's a report. But the direction it moves is opposite for scientists as it is for readers or listeners. And scientists have to be able to switch and tell the story as a story, because honestly, nobody's going to pay attention if it doesn't have some sort of personal touch. So people always said, Daily Planet, same with Quirks and Quarks, those are science shows. They weren't science shows, they were people shows. Every person, well, first of all, we really didn't report anything on Daily Planet unless there was a researcher or some sort of person associated with it. It just so happened that all of them had some sort of connection to science and technology. Sometimes very tenuous connection, but it didn't matter. They were interesting people and they told a story. That's the only reason we became a popular show. If we had been just deadpan reporting stories taken right out of scientific journals, we would have been off cable in like 2 months. So it's how you tell the story. I just finished a workshop in Calgary that we ran last week, and we had about 10 people. And they all, over the course of 3 days, had to develop about a 7-minute presentation that they would give on the Friday afternoon. The best presentations were those where the person was actually involved in the story. They were telling a personal story. All of them were fine. They all had, interesting scientific results, but they were impersonal. And it just doesn't work as well. Convincing scientists to do that is a long haul.
We worked a lot with astronauts back then. And it's no surprise that Chris Hadfield was the best of them all as a science communicator. With some of them, I won't mention the names for this, you could see the media training coming in. You could see them go into media training mode. But what Chris was exceptional at was telling stories that he found fascinating. And if he was fascinated by them, you would be fascinated. I remember one interview you did with him where we talked about how hard it was to work inside a spacesuit because there was no gravity and you'd have to leverage yourself inside the spacesuit and you'd come out bruised. There just aren't a lot of people like that. So how do we get these communicators? How do we train these communicators or get these communicators out there?
I'll answer that, but let me tell you, the story that Hadfield told us that I remember probably better than any of the others was when he was a fighter pilot, and they used to get scrambled to warn Soviet at the time aircraft that they were getting too close to Canadian airspace. And what I like about that story is it gave us another facet into his life. I would also say astronauts have a huge advantage because they're already stars of a kind. And they're going into space or they've been into space. That makes them special. What if you're a bacteriologist? Well, you don't really have that cachet.
It's not as sexy, is it?
No, and so that's why. I mean, let me give you an example from geology. That was always something that was pretty hard to do in radio or TV in my career, unless there'd been some sort of cataclysmic event, an earthquake, a volcano, right? Recently in the Canadian Rockies, there was a landslide that killed 2 people. And the first reports were pretty scary because they thought maybe 20 people had been buried. Now, if you're a geologist, and we had one in our workshop, he was suddenly being asked to do interviews, honest to God, every 15 minutes. And he was good because he knew that area. This was in Alberta. We were in Alberta. And he had a pretty good idea of what had happened. But they're not calling him this week. And, if they do, what's he going to say? It doesn't have that emotional piece to it why would NBC call a geologist in Alberta to talk about a landslide unless it had this emotional criticality that people have died? And so if you don't have that, if you're not an astronaut and you're not sort of super special in one way or another, you've got to make it personal. You've got to say, I've hiked that path, and the last time I was there, I looked up and I saw that spring running, and I thought there's a lot of water behind those rocks, and when the freeze-thaw cycle hits, this may be trouble. Just something like that. So how do we do that? We just have to send them to boot camp and get them to tell personal stories. But look, it's hard work. The Banff Science Communications program that Craig mentioned at the beginning, we had 20 people, mostly PhDs, some PhD students. They would be at the Banff Center for 2 weeks solid, producing podcasts, the kind of thing that you're interested in, Scott, like op-ed type articles, videos, everything. But it was 2 weeks. And so when I get asked to do a workshop that's 3 hours, I mean, they've got to do the work, right? That's what a workshop is about. It's not about me telling them what to do, because if they don't do it, and then you hear how they've done it and you can help them, it's never going to happen.
Do you think by personalizing the stories, which Craig and I both are obviously huge fans of, because that's what we've done for 37 and 36 years respectively, do you think that will help break down the mistrust that so many people have in science? If they can see that these are real people, maybe your neighbors, things like that. Do you think that is part of the key, or what do you think so much of this distrust is about?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I'd like to be optimistic and say the more personalized the science stories are, the better it'll be. And there are people, there are some really exceptional people, um, that have the right way to talk about things like climate change. But they can be personal and they can be sincere. They can't alter the fact that they're scientists, and they can't alter the fact that the people they'd most like to reach are suspicious of them. And so I really think this is not going to, there's isn't going to be an immediate turnaround back to the Lotus Land days where everybody loved science and had a subscription to Discover magazine and everything else. We're in a different place right now, the polarized social media place, and it will evolve, and it might well evolve in a direction that'll make it uh, more rational to talk about science. But the the ideal way would be to get proponents and opponents at a table together. I don't know how that's ever going to happen, but you can imagine, a pub setting, people there to watch the hockey game. Turns out the guys at the table next to you are don't believe in vaccines. You get into a conversation. You actually have a bit of a bond in that you're in the same pub watching the same hockey game, and maybe you're cheering for the same team. Any sort of common ground that can be established will facilitate better conversations, but it has to be a conversation. So, yeah, it's I'm giving you kind of weak answers, I fear, because
They're
um,
tough questions.
this is it's sort of at the moment it seems like a very, very difficult, maybe not intractable, but a very difficult problem. And I think hitting opposition hard is absolutely, well, it's useless. I think I might have said to Craig when we were preparing for this that, it used to be a big deal to have creationists debate evolutionary scientists. And I always thought that it was such a complete waste of time because not one person in the audience would change their minds.
Right.
Not one. And in fact, they would reject all the information coming from the person with whom they disagreed. So, what was the point of this?
Mhm.
And we got to get away from that. And it's hard when, social media allows people like RFK to dominate.
Mm.
And once there's domination, you're never going to get any rational discussion.
Well, we've got some people watching, so if anybody has a question, type it in the comments and I'll see it. We can get your question to Jay. But what you talked about was, communication. We often think of in the media as just one way out there, but you're talking a lot about interpersonal communications. And my big thing now, and the thing I'm going to be pushing more and speaking opportunities in writing is listening. Communication starts with listening. Your best conversations, the way you win in an argument is you understand somebody else's point of view rather than try to turn them around to yours. That's a mug's game. And it's also in the research that I've seen, people are way more likely to listen to your point of view if you listen to their point of view first and try to show that you can articulate what they think and understand what they think.
Yeah. I think such a situation has to have a period before it even starts where you at least accept the other person as a human being. I mean, I'm obviously exaggerating, but until you get people in a place where they're even willing to listen, either side, uh, it's going to be difficult. And, I think you can both envision a situation where, um, let's say, well, anti vaccine is a good position. Vaccine apprehensive, vaccine hesitant, whatever you want to call it. Um, where do you start that conversation? Think about it. I'm pro vaccine, they're not. Um, what I shouldn't do is say, "Where'd you get that crazy idea?" That's it's tricky.
There was one social experiment that people did. They videotaped it, fortunately, where they took two people who didn't know each other and they had them put together IKEA furniture. And they worked together putting the IKEA furniture, and they had pre-interviewed them. They had video of them beforehand. And then they sat down and they talked about who they were. It eventually got to, the big issue, I'm gay, I oppose gay marriage. And they showed them the comments they'd made in the pre-interview before that. And the turnaround in people was pretty spectacular. It's very easy to have very strong held opinions about, especially about people, when you're not faced with those people at all. But as you went back to the beginning, it's really, if you really want to have a good debate between evolutionists and creationists, get them to talk about something else first and see if there's common ground in there. Maybe that's the more interesting conversation to have, to see where they agree on what's best for the world, even though they're in different camps.
Yeah, that's perhaps not the best example because I don't think there's any common ground between creationists and evolutionists. But yeah, like, you guys in the East have endured 3 days of incredibly uncomfortable heat. Well, it's just another heat wave. Well, we had heat waves in the 40s, right? But come on, people, look at the pattern. What is correlated with the pattern? Oh, funnily enough, carbon dioxide's rising. Oh, yeah, but plants love carbon dioxide. We keep pumping carbon dioxide into the air. Plants are going to be luxuriant. Yeah, they are. But you're going to be gasping for air because it's going to be 45 degrees and high humidity. There are some things, and there are prominent people who actually deliberately lie.
Mm-hmm.
And can you think of any?
I can think of, we don't have enough time for me to go through the list, but I've been involved with some of them, and to say that the world is going to be improved by more carbon dioxide, like, it actually defies discussion. Okay, so where I think we have to concentrate efforts to communicate better is with people who may have reasons for personally not wanting needles stuck into them, or they don't understand the mechanics of disease prevention. They don't understand the immune system. They don't, as a result of some of these beliefs, which you might be able to discuss, they then extrapolate to things like, well, I don't believe the stats of how many cases of COVID-19 were prevented. Well, like, do you not believe any numbers? You see, at some point, the common ground might be, like we were talking about baseball just before we went live. Baseball fans dote on statistics and numbers. That, as far as I can tell, is like one of the mainstays of the game. Well, I bet, are some of those people listening to baseball stats and taking them in at the same time not believing COVID-19 stats? Yes, there are. Why are they doing that? Because they distrust authority. There's always another reason. And so somehow, and I'm frankly, as you can tell, don't really know what the best approach is going to be. But we have to understand better where the resistance comes from, because I think quite often the resistance to science is not really based on an extensive understanding of how science works.
Well, do you think that, so, let's use Alberta as an example, right? Alberta, obviously a huge producer of oil and gas. Oil and gas, of course, are a major contributor to global warming. In Alberta, they love their oil and gas. But that's jobs, right? That is the economy. That's their livelihood. And in some ways, it may even be their career, their passion, right?
Right.
So how do you, that's a tough one. That's a tough one to sell to people. It's just like, the fishermen out in the East Coast with the cod, right? When your livelihood depends on it, it's very easy just to turn a blind eye to the facts and say, we need this and it's our right.
Yeah, well, that happened to all the people who took care of the horses at the turn of the 19th, 20th century that were drawing cabs in, cities in the United States. And then they all lost their jobs, as did the horses. At some point, change happens, right? I mean, I think oil and gas workers should be just as afraid of AI as they are. And, so we're in an interesting time right now because the federal Canadian government um, seems to have set aside climate change uh, efforts and concentrate on let's become an energy superpower. Those are the words of the prime minister. Energy superpower. That does involve fossil fuels. How can you accommodate these two issues? Well, one way would be to use carbon capture so that the carbon dioxide generated not just by the production, but by the ultimate burning of oil and gas can be perhaps dramatically reduced by pumping it underground. I mean, there's been talk about this in Alberta for a long time, but my ungenerous estimate of what's gone on is that there's been foot dragging because it's expensive, because it's going to require a long pipeline to take the carbon dioxide and put it underground, and it gets in the way of profits. So until some government at some level decides, look, we can balance the jobs by saying, yes, we're going to expand oil and gas, but we're going to capture a significant portion of the carbon dioxide emitted. And there's talk now, but talk,
Yeah.
just talk.
Speaking of talking, which you're very good at, Jay, that's why you're here. You hit on something like people just don't understand the science, right? Science for a lot of people is the thing they didn't want to take in high school. I loved working in science. I thought going from working in sports and going to working in science would be a letdown in some way, but I loved it more. What are the best ways to get people interested in science?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, tell them stories. Because let's face it, you and I worked together on a show that did 5 hours a week of science. Did we ever get technical? Almost never. If we did a story about chemistry of plastics, we never got into carbon bonding in plastics. I mean, we were sensible enough to know that our viewers didn't want to take chemistry in high school or university either. Organic chemistry, one of the worst. I took it. I know. But that's not what people talk about. What do people talk about? The stock market, their sports teams, their political parties, the movies they want to see, the music they like. Do music fans think a lot about what went on in the studio to create that piece of music? I don't think so. The musicians do, but the fans don't. The fans just want to listen to the music. It's, again, all about music tells stories about either the artist or the songs themselves. So, scientists, National Geographic has a really good idea where they portray many of their scientists as adventurers. They go to the lip of a volcano. They tell you some really cool stuff about volcanoes, but it's mixed with looking down into a bottomless pit of magma. I mean, it's, scary and cool. Antarctic research, fascinating. People love animals. Look at Attenborough. There's a reason that those are so popular. There is a kind of, the technical term is biophilia. We are attracted to most other living things except poisonous or vicious ones, but we're even fascinated by that. Like living in Alberta, one of the most exciting things about going on a trail in the woods is that you might meet a bear, and if it's twilight, you might meet a cougar. It just gives that little extra thrill. to just getting some exercise. But, programs and people that talk about things that we are confident people are interested in are successful. People that try and tell people about things they're not really interested in and then don't even try to make a story around that, a personal story, to make it a little more interesting, that doesn't work.
There isn't a child alive who's gone to bed at night and asked their parents, "Can you please read me some data?" We're just built to have stories. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jay. This is the time in the show where we promote our books. So I'm going to promote your book first. I think it seems like the right thing to do. Look at this. I took this off your Instagram page. Indigo's most anticipated Canadian books. The Science of Pets. It's 30% off on a pre-order. You want to get this right now. It's all about dogs and cats, right, Jay?
Yeah, you know what? When I was first thinking about writing this book, I read that there are 70,000 books on Amazon about dogs. And I thought, okay, well, then it's sort of pointless to write about dogs and cats. And so I set out to write more about humans, because for every pet, there's a human. And how much we control and dictate the form and populations and looks and everything else of pets is really what I came away with. But the problem, and you can't just skip dogs and cats, partly because those are by far the most common pets. And also 90% of, maybe more, 95% of the science has been done with dogs and cats. So, anyway, I had a lot of fun because, writing about how wolves gradually turned into dogs and how wild cats turned into domestic cats. That's kind of cool and interesting stuff. It involves fossils and like even touching scenarios of a fossil human with its arm over the skeleton of a dog, and they were buried that way. You think, wow, man, that's 14,000 years ago, and people loved their dogs then. And, fossils so hard to find. I wouldn't be surprised if within 5 years an older dog would be found, and then who knows, they may go back 20, 30,000, maybe more years. So anyway, I won't go on, but there's lots of stuff in that book.
That's a good story right there.
Good story.
Scott, what about your book?
So this is my book on how to write compelling op-eds and short memoirs. So it's very apropos of our discussion today about storytelling, how to effectively capture people's attention, and putting the information first. That's a big key. And so that's.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Absolutely.
So if you were to be in a workshop with scientists,
yes,
would you essentially say the same things that you say in your book, recognizing that these are people who don't know how to tell a story?
Exactly. I've done seminars with scientists, and that's basically it. Academics. I tell them that they've got their whole storytelling backwards. And of course, these are all very smart people, and they all nod their heads and they go, "Yeah, you're right. They get it." Because that's what I found.
I think they nod their heads and they think, "Hey, this has been a great experience," and then they go back to doing what they did.
Well, that might happen too. But when I leave them at the end, they all go, "Oh yeah, you're right." And we do little projects, like I'll do a thesis writing thing with them, right? Where you have an idea for an op-ed. Write the thesis statement, right? And then that's when you expose whether they get it or don't get it.
Yeah. We sort of progress through elevator pitch to a short personal piece to something longer and try and convince them that it's the same structure. You're just expanding it a little bit with each step. Yeah. But, the problem to me is then they go home.
Yeah,
and then
don't let them go home. That's the big problem.
You gotta come back to your house.
Yeah, no, you should never let them go home. They should be imprisoned, and because they'll go home and they'll go to work the next day, and they'll. It's just too easy to fall back on what you've always done. I'm doing a podcast on how to lower your risk for dementia by adopting, sensible lifestyle things. And my constant worry, because we have a lot of valuable things that we tell people, um, my constant worry is, are people actually going to change? Are they going to, tweak their diet? Are they going to get a little more exercise? Are they going to stay social? Are they going to, as they get older, are they going to try and integrate into some sort of constant social group? Because I think
Will they wear
it
their
all
hearing
makes
aid?
sense. Yeah, it all makes sense. But you got to do it. I know all these things, and I'm very inconsistent at adopting them all. So, you know, that's I think whenever we do work, all of three of us do workshops, the the cruel question is, are people going to be doing what we've suggested, what we've encouraged, what we've had them do in the workshop 6 months from now?
You have to make it easy for them. Very good, Jay. Not only did you plug your book, you plugged your podcast at the same time.
Yeah, I know.
That is why you are the big communicator. I'm going to plug my books.
I'll plug your book too if you want.
Okay. Well, this is personal stories told through baseball caps. If you like the personal stories, that's there. You can kind of only get that from me or at the library now. And my new book, The Unqualified Hockey Coach. These are the proof copies I'm going through just to make sure the books look good. I'm changing words because you can't help it. And that's out in August. Again, personal stories.
Two really good titles. And titles are important. But
yes.
Especially all caps. I love that title.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that one just came to me. All right, Jay, thank you so much. One of my favorite people I've ever worked with, one of the best broadcasters I've ever seen, let alone worked with. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Great to see you again, Craig, and good to meet you and talk to you, Scott.
Yes, you too, Jay.
Okay, bye, guys.
Bye.